In the bloody annals of the American frontier, no outlaw ever orchestrated a more spectacular, deeply humiliating surrender than Henry Starr. Today we are tearing down the romanticized myths of the Old West in the real Henry Starr, the most tragic Hollywood illusion of the Wild West. He was the first bank robber in history to establish his own motion picture company, officially pricing, packaging, and selling his own life as a theatrical spectacle. He willingly traded the freezing plains for the safety of a film set, substituting real ammunition for harmless blank cartridges. He believed he had beaten the capitalist system at its own game, laundering his violent crimes into a highly lucrative cinematic empire. But this grand, life-changing act was a catastrophic failure. The safety of the silver screen was a suffocating illusion. The entertainment machine did not starve him to death. It completely emasculated him, transforming a genuine apex predator into a domesticated circus animal, performing for the very upper-class elites who had once demanded his execution. The daily humiliation of firing fake bullets for a paying public proved far more fatal to his pride than any lawman's gun. Why would a man who had successfully conquered Hollywood, accumulated wealth, and secured his freedom suddenly throw away the script, pick up a fully loaded revolver, and walk into a real bank to claim the bullet that would end his life? The bloodline of Henry Starr was practically royalty in the underworld of the American West. Born into the notorious Starr clan, a family intimately entangled with the legendary bandit queen Belle Starr, Henry was the natural heir to a violent and lawless dynasty. But he was not a crude, uneducated bushwhacker. Born with Cherokee blood running through his veins, Starr was a complex, terrifying paradox, a voracious reader who devoured classical literature and philosophy between holdups. He possessed a highly intelligent, fiercely strategic mind. He did not rob financial institutions by kicking down doors with guns blazing in a hail of chaotic, amateur gunfire. He orchestrated his heists with the calculating, cold-blooded discipline of a corporate takeover. But what made Henry Starr truly terrifying was his bizarre, unwavering personal asceticism. He was an anomaly in the criminal underworld, a man who vehemently refused to touch alcohol, never smoked, strictly forbade his gang members from using profanity in the presence of women, and treated the bank tellers he held at gunpoint with the terrifying, polite articulation of a Wall Street auditor. He constructed a powerful psychological delusion, viewing himself not as a violent thief, but as a gentlemanly rebel extracting a just tax from corrupt capitalist institutions. His sheer charisma and this flawless facade of intellectual nobility were so undeniable that he achieved something no other outlaw in history could claim. He successfully manipulated the highest levels of the United States government, earning a presidential pardon from Theodore Roosevelt himself in 1903. This calculated brilliance allowed him to achieve a staggering criminal milestone. He successfully robbed 21 banks, eclipsing the combined records of Jesse James and the infamous Dalton Gang. However, Starr was operating on borrowed time. He came of age during a ruthless transitional period when the untamed frontier was rapidly being dismantled by the unstoppable forces of industrialization. The open, lawless ranges of the Indian Territory were permanently carved up by steel railway tracks, and the sky was suddenly crisscrossed by sprawling telegraph wires that could outrun any horse. The vulnerable wooden banks of his youth evolved into imposing fortresses of brick and steel, guarded by the relentless, heavily funded operatives of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. This corporate shadow army did not merely hunt Starr, they waged a brutal, highly organized war of attrition. They systematically poisoned his traditional safe havens, using staggering corporate bounties to turn lifelong friends and rural sympathizers into eager informants. The romanticized freedom of the horseback outlaw dissolved into a grueling, paranoid reality of sleeping in the freezing mud, perpetually listening for the crack of a Pinkerton rifle. When the Pinkerton machine inevitably caught him, the state did not just lock him in a cage, they intended to bleed him dry. His meticulously hidden wealth was aggressively hunted down and seized by the authorities, while the remainder was siphoned away by a parade of expensive defense attorneys until he was rendered entirely destitute. Inside the damp, claustrophobic confines of the federal penitentiary, the psychological torture truly began. The legendary outlaw was systematically stripped of his humanity, his name replaced by a mere sequence of digits stamped onto rough canvas. But Henry Starr refused to let his brilliant mind rot in a 6-by-8-foot cage. Instead of quietly surrendering to forced labor, he weaponized his confinement. He turned the prison library into his personal war room, obsessively studying state and federal law. He began writing his own highly sophisticated legal briefs, outsmarting wardens, and demonstrating a legal acumen that utterly terrified the very prosecutors who had put him there. Yet despite this ferocious intellectual rebellion, he suffered the agonizing realization that the American landscape outside was accelerating into a dizzying, hyper-industrialized future. No matter how brilliantly he argued the law from the inside, his body was becoming a relic, buried alive in limestone. The physical and psychological toll of this grinding lifestyle fueled a deep, desperate crisis within him. Decades of sleeping in the wilderness and enduring the bone-chilling cold of unheated solitary confinement cells had severely ravaged his body. Old, improperly healed bullet wounds ached with a dull throb, and his reflexes had noticeably slowed. Driven by a severely bruised ego, a desperate lack of capital, and the terrifying specter of total irrelevance, Henry orchestrated the most catastrophic operation of his entire career. In March 1915, fueled by a toxic mixture of hubris and necessity, he attempted to prove he was still the undisputed master of the frontier. He planned a feat that had previously annihilated the infamous Dalton Gang, the simultaneous robbery of 2 banks in broad daylight in Stroud, Oklahoma. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The citizens of the 20th century West were no longer passive victims. They were hardened, heavily armed, and fiercely protective of their towns. In a bitter, deeply humiliating twist of fate, the brilliant mastermind who had outsmarted the Pinkertons for decades was not brought down by a seasoned federal marshal. As the chaotic shootout erupted in the dusty streets, a 15-year-old local boy named Paul Curry, armed with a borrowed Winchester rifle, stepped into the open. The teenager calmly fired a single shot. The heavy bullet shattered Starr's femur, sweeping his legs from beneath him and dropping the great outlaw violently into the Oklahoma dirt. Dragged back into the merciless jaws of the judicial system, he spent his remaining prime years enduring the grim, repetitive misery of the notorious McAllister Penitentiary, permanently crippled. When the heavy steel doors finally swung open in 1919, releasing a 50-year-old limping Henry Starr back into the blinding sunlight of the Roaring Twenties, the corporate machinery had achieved its ultimate goal. They had patiently waited for the world to render him entirely obsolete, leaving him standing destitute on the precipice of a new, terrifying frontier, the entertainment industry. When Henry Starr limped out of the heavy iron gates of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in 1919, he did not step into the dust of the Old West. He stepped onto the bustling, electrified precipice of the Roaring Twenties. The America that greeted him was ravenous for entertainment. Across the country, in glittering metropolitan centers and dusty rural towns alike, grand movie palaces and cheap Nickelodeons were multiplying at an astonishing rate. The motion picture industry was rapidly transforming from a chaotic novelty into a colossal, multi-million-dollar capitalist empire. And what this new mechanized society craved above all else was the mythological violence of the very frontier they had just ruthlessly paved over. Audiences were paying millions of dimes to sit in darkened theaters and watch silent westerns. But Henry Starr, watching from the margins with his sharp, calculating eyes, immediately recognized the fundamental flaw in these cinematic spectacles. The men on the silver screen were polished actors from New York and California. They wore pristine, tailored cowboy costumes, fired guns that had never shed a drop of blood, and rode horses with the awkward posture of city dwellers. To a man who had survived the freezing mud of the Indian Territory and the relentless gunfire of Pinkerton ambushes, it was an offensive, comical artifice. But within that artifice, Henry's brilliant strategic mind identified a staggering opportunity. He realized that in a marketplace flooded with cheap imitations, he possessed the most valuable, unreplicable commodity in the world: absolute blood-soaked authenticity. The entertainment industry and the dime novel publishers were circling him, eager to buy his life rights for a miserable fraction of their worth, intending to exploit his name and discard him. But Henry Starr was a mastermind who had orchestrated dozens of the most complex bank heists in American history. He refused to be reduced to a cheap pawn in someone else's corporate game. If the capitalist machine wanted to consume his legacy, he would not sell it to them. He would build the factory himself. In a move of staggering, unparalleled audacity, the 50-year-old, heavily scarred, paroled bank robber decided to hack the system. Bypassing the established studio executives of the East Coast, Henry leveraged his legendary charisma and his terrifying notoriety to secure independent financial backing. He navigated the boardrooms of investors with the same chilling confidence he had once used to dominate the lobbies of Midwestern banks. Against all conventional logic, he successfully established his own production company, the Pan American Motion Picture Corporation. He was no longer just an outlaw. He was the president and lead producer of a legitimate corporate entity. For his inaugural production, Henry did not choose a fictional narrative or a sanitized tale of frontier heroism. With a dark theatrical genius, he chose to adapt the most traumatic, devastating moment of his entire life. The film would be titled A Debtor to the Law, and it would be a meticulous, frame-by-frame cinematic recreation of the disastrous 1915 double bank robbery in Stroud, Oklahoma. The very heist that had shattered his femur, destroyed his gang, and robbed him of years of his life. The production of the film was a surreal, unprecedented event in American history. Henry Starr served as the writer, the technical advisor, and the leading man, playing himself. He brought his camera crews to the actual locations of his crimes. He meticulously instructed the actors playing his accomplices and the lawmen on exactly how to hold their weapons, how to take cover, and how men truly moved when lethal lead was tearing through the air. He orchestrated the fake bank robbery with the same rigid discipline and tactical precision he had applied to the real ones. For Henry, directing this film was an act of profound psychological dominance. He was taking the greatest defeat of his life, a trauma that the state had used to break him, and he was packaging it, directing it, and monetizing it. When A Debtor to the Law premiered, the public response was nothing short of an absolute phenomenon. The advertising practically wrote itself. Come see the greatest bank robber in history, acting out his own crimes. Audiences across the nation stormed the box offices, desperate to catch a glimpse of the terrifying prairie wolf captured on celluloid. The film was a massive, undeniable commercial triumph. The revenues poured in, completely overwhelming the costs of production. The transformation of Henry Starr was breathtaking. The coarse, degrading, striped uniform of the McAllister Penitentiary was discarded, replaced once again by the impeccably tailored, expensive three-piece suits he favored. The hollow, destitute ex-convict vanished, replaced by a wealthy, celebrated cinematic auteur. He toured the country alongside the reels of his film. He stood on the stages of grand, velvet-draped theaters before the lights went down, looking out at audiences composed of the very upper-class elites, bankers, railway executives, and politicians who had spent decades funding the Pinkertons to hunt him down. Now, these same elites were willingly handing over their money for the privilege of watching him work, erupting into thunderous applause when he finished his moralistic speeches about the consequences of a life of crime. In those initial, intoxicating months of his cinematic success, Henry Starr experienced a profound, overwhelming sense of vindication. He believed with every fiber of his being that he had executed the ultimate flawless heist. He had stolen his own life back from the judicial system. He had infiltrated the impenetrable fortress of the Gilded Age economy, not with a loaded revolver and a stick of dynamite, but with a camera and a projector. The blood money that had been confiscated by the courts was now being returned to him tenfold in the form of completely legal, untraceable box office receipts. As he stood in the glow of the theater marquees, bearing his name in giant illuminated letters, Henry Starr believed he had achieved total victory. He had successfully manipulated the deepest hypocrisies of American capitalism, proving that a society obsessed with profit would gladly embrace a monster, so long as that monster generated revenue. He had washed his blood-stained hands in the flowing rivers of Hollywood cash, but the brilliant strategic outlaw was entirely unaware that the trap he thought he had escaped was merely closing around him in a different, far more suffocating shape. He had conquered the business of the silver screen, but he had not yet realized the devastating, corrosive price the screen would demand from his soul. The intoxicating triumph that Henry Starr felt upon the release of his cinematic debut was a magnificent, glittering illusion, an illusion that began to dissolve almost the moment the cameras stopped rolling. He had successfully infiltrated the capitalist machine, transforming his blood-soaked criminal record into a highly lucrative enterprise, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the true nature of the beast he was trying to ride. The motion picture industry did not merely want his story, it wanted his soul, repackaged and sanitized for mass consumption. As the initial euphoria of box office receipts began to settle, the daily grinding reality of his new existence as a Hollywood commodity set in, initiating a psychological erosion far more devastating than any physical punishment he had endured inside the limestone walls of the McAllister Penitentiary. Henry Starr had traded the iron cage of the federal prison system for a gilded cage constructed of celluloid, Klieg lights, and theatrical makeup, and the realization of his own domestication was a slow, agonizing poison. The profound depth of this humiliation was rooted in the very psychology of the frontier outlaw. For decades, Henry Starr had existed as an undisputed wolf in a hostile, unforgiving ecosystem. His entire identity, his pride, and his survival were inextricably linked to his absolute autonomy and his capacity for lethal violence. When he had walked into the marble lobbies of Midwestern banks, he was the undisputed master of his environment. He had commanded the room not with a loud voice, but with the terrifying, icy silence of a man who held the power of life and death in the palm of his hand. He remembered the visceral, electric reality of those moments, the sharp intake of breath from the bank tellers, the unmistakable metallic scent of genuine fear, the heavy, reassuring weight of a fully loaded Colt revolver resting against his thigh, and the absolute, unquestioning compliance of wealthy bank managers who would drop to their knees at his slightest gesture. In the real world, Henry Starr was a force of nature, a hurricane of consequence that shattered the quiet, predictable lives of the American middle class. The environment of a film set, however, was an entirely different universe, one defined by rigid artificiality and humiliating subservience. The transition was brutally jarring. He was no longer the undisputed commander of an operation. He was an employee, subject to the frantic, shouted orders of a film director holding a megaphone. The man who had spent his life meticulously outsmarting the Pinkerton National Detective Agency was now being told where to stand, how to angle his face to catch the artificial light, and how to artificially widen his eyes to simulate a fear he had never genuinely felt. The meticulous life-or-death planning of a real heist was replaced by the chaotic, repetitive indignity of multiple takes. If he did not draw his weapon with enough theatrical flair, the scene was cut, and he was forced to perform the action again and again until it satisfied the aesthetic preferences of men who had never fired a gun in anger. But the most excruciating indignity of the filming process was the requirement to recreate his own physical destruction. For the climax of the picture, Henry was forced to meticulously reenact the Stroud Bank robbery, the very event that had permanently crippled him and ended his reign as a free man. Under the glaring heat of the studio lights, he had to intentionally throw himself from a horse. He had to deliberately drag his body through the dirt, contorting his face into expressions of exaggerated agony, mimicking the moment the Winchester rifle had shattered his femur. He was forced to actively participate in the mockery of his own profound trauma. Every time the director yelled for another take, Henry was required to mentally revisit the greatest, most agonizing defeat of his life, not to learn from it, but to ensure the lighting was adequately capturing the fake blood smeared across his trousers. It was a grotesque, unnatural act of self-mutilation performed for the camera. This psychological emasculation was perfectly encapsulated in the primary tool of his new trade, the blank cartridge. For a man who had survived the violent twilight of the Wild West, a firearm was not a prop. It was a sacred instrument of survival, an extension of his own will. A real bullet possessed a terrifying, undeniable gravity. It carried consequence. But the revolvers handed to him by the studio prop masters were loaded with blanks, impotent shells packed with a dusting of powder that produced a loud noise and a plume of harmless white smoke, but possessed absolutely no kinetic energy, no lethal force, and no real power. The first time Henry pulled the trigger on a film set, the lack of a harsh, violent recoil against the palm of his hand felt like a sickening betrayal. The gun was physically empty, and in his hands, it felt like a symbol of his own spiritual castration. He was pantomiming violence, a defanged wolf forced to bare his teeth and bark on command, knowing full well that he could no longer bite. This deep, simmering degradation was further amplified by the theatrical arrest that concluded the cinematic narratives. In the real world, Henry Starr had fought lawmen with a savage, desperate ferocity, fully aware that capture meant a living death in a federal cage. But for the cameras, to satisfy the moralistic requirements of the era's censorship boards and the comfort of the ticket-buying public, the outlaw always had to be brought to justice. Henry was contractually obligated to willingly raise his hands in surrender. He had to stand docile and obedient while actors, men who wore pristine, unsoiled badges and had never tracked a fugitive through the freezing rain, slapped heavy iron cuffs onto his wrists. He had to lower his head in a pantomime of remorse, waiting for the director to yell "cut" so the prop master could step in with a small key and unlock the shackles. It was a safe, sanitized, pathetic simulation of a reality that had cost him years of his life, reducing his genuine, bloody struggles against the state to a cheap parlor trick. When the filming concluded and Henry began touring the country to promote the picture, the true agonizing depth of his new reality finally crystallized. He stood on the polished hardwood stages of the grandest, most opulent movie palaces in the United States. He wore expensive tailored silk suits, his hair neatly slicked back, leaning heavily on a walking cane due to his shattered leg. As the heavy velvet curtains parted and the lights illuminated his face, he looked out into the cavernous auditoriums, and what he saw filled him with a cold, suffocating nausea. The seats were not filled with his peers from the frontier. They were filled with the architects of the new industrialized America. Sitting in the plush, expensive balcony seats were the local bank managers, the railway executives, the wealthy merchants, and the political elite. These were the exact same demographics that had spent the last 30 years terrified of his name. These were the men who had pooled their vast corporate wealth to hire the Pinkerton Agency, demanding that Henry Starr be hunted down and eradicated like vermin to protect their ledgers. But now, they were not looking at him with fear. They were looking at him with a casual, condescending amusement. As Henry concluded his required moralistic speech about the dangers of a criminal lifestyle, the audience would erupt into thunderous, polite applause. That sound, the rhythmic clapping of gloved hands from the wealthy elite, was the most devastating sound he had ever heard. It was not the sound of respect, it was the sound of absolute, undeniable ownership. The applause was a declaration of victory by the capitalist machine. They were clapping because he was no longer a threat to their banks or their trains. They were clapping because the terrifying, uncontrollable force of the frontier had been successfully captured, commodified, and tamed. They had not needed to hang him. They had simply bought his docility with a share of the box office receipts. He was their performing bear, an exotic, dangerous creature safely locked behind the invisible bars of the silver screen, brought out to provide a brief thrill before the audience returned to their comfortable, secure lives. The money he earned from this grotesque spectacle poured into his bank accounts, but the wealth felt fundamentally contaminated. In his previous life, the money he stole was a physical manifestation of his rebellion, a tangible victory violently extracted from a system he despised. The money he earned from Hollywood was a daily reminder of his submission. It was a wage paid for his obedience. He attempted to drown the growing hollow sensation in his chest by leaning heavily into the entertainment industry, taking his act on the road by joining a traveling Wild West show. He thought perhaps the raw energy of a live audience, the smell of sawdust and horse manure, might reignite the dormant spark of his old life. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The circus crowds were infinitely worse than the theater audiences. They were fickle, easily distracted, and ravenously hungry for cheap sensation. Henry was paraded out into dusty, crowded arenas, flanked by fake cowboys and painted wagons. The audiences ate roasted peanuts and pointed their fingers, treating him like an interactive museum exhibit. They shouted demands for him to perform his famous gun tricks, demanding a return on the quarters they had paid for admission. He was a living ghost forced to endlessly haunt the circus tents of a society that had completely moved on without him. The profound, suffocating boredom of this existence began to rot his mind. The repetitive, daily grind of faking his own life, of smiling for the crowds and firing blank cartridges into the air, became a psychological torture far more acute than the solitary confinement cells of McAllister. By the freezing winter of 1921, the novelty of the silver screen had entirely metastasized into a profound psychological torment. Henry Starr found himself sitting in opulent hotel rooms, surrounded by legitimate wealth, yet consumed by an agonizing, paralytic boredom. The applause of the theater audiences was no longer a validation of his intelligence. It was a ringing confirmation of his complete domestication. A prairie wolf without teeth does not simply learn to eat grass. It starves to death from the inside out. To cure this terminal boredom, he realized he required a highly specific, exceptionally dangerous medicine: the violent, unpredictable chaos of reality. To cure this terminal boredom, Henry realized he required a highly specific, exceptionally dangerous medicine. He needed the violent, unpredictable chaos of reality. He systematically severed his ties with the polished, artificial world of the motion picture industry. He stopped answering the telegrams from producers and walked away from the velvet-lined movie palaces. Instead, he reached back into the dark, receding shadows of the underworld, seeking out men who did not possess Screen Actors Guild cards or theatrical agents. He recruited 3 hardened, desperate accomplices, men who still understood the brutal mathematics of the frontier, men who were willing to wager their lives for a share of a vault. They were not actors hired to play a role. They were lethal instruments required for a genuine high-stakes operation. The target Henry selected was a testament to his returning arrogance and his desperate need to feel the adrenaline of his youth. He chose the First National Bank in the prosperous, quiet town of Harrison, situated in the rugged Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. It was a classic, imposing financial fortress, a far cry from the flimsy, painted wooden sets constructed on the back lots of California studios. It was built of solid brick and stone, designed to project an aura of absolute corporate invulnerability. For Henry, it was the perfect stage for his resurrection. The logistics of the operation reflected the strange, transitional era in which he was now operating. He was a 19th century horseback outlaw, utilizing the mechanized tools of the 20th century. On the morning of Friday, February 18, 1921, Henry and his crew did not ride into Harrison on saddle-weary Mustangs. They drove a fast, powerful motor car into the heart of the town. The vibration of the internal combustion engine beneath his boots, the sharp industrial scent of gasoline and burning oil. It was a modern overture to an ancient violent ritual. Sitting in the passenger seat as the Arkansas winter landscape blurred past the glass, Henry experienced a sensation he had not felt in years, the cold, electric, hyper-focused clarity of impending combat. As the motor car idled outside the imposing facade of the First National Bank, Henry reached into his heavy wool coat and drew his weapon. It was a .38 caliber revolver. He broke open the cylinder and methodically inspected the ammunition. This was the moment the Hollywood illusion officially died. He was not staring at the crimped, empty brass casings of theatrical blank cartridges. He was looking at heavy, solid lead projectiles, packed tightly over charges of lethal, smokeless powder. He ran his thumb over the cold metal of the bullets, savoring the immense, terrifying gravity they represented. These small cylinders of lead possessed the kinetic energy to tear through flesh, to shatter bone, and to end human life. They were the ultimate, undeniable arbiters of reality. When he snapped the cylinder shut, the sharp, metallic clack echoed in the confined space of the car like a judge's gavel. The actor was dead. The ultimate apex of the American frontier had returned to claim his territory. Henry stepped out of the motor car, his boots crunching heavily against the frost-covered pavement. He pulled his hat down low over his eyes and turned up the collar of his coat to shield his deeply scarred, recognizable face from the biting morning wind. The air in Harrison was incredibly crisp, lacking the artificial smoke and stifling heat of the film studios. He walked toward the heavy, ornate double doors of the bank with a deliberate, measured stride. Despite his age and despite the permanent, agonizing limp from the Pinkerton bullet that had shattered his leg in Stroud years earlier, his posture was radiating absolute, terrifying command. He placed his hands against the heavy brass handles of the bank doors. For a fraction of a second, he paused, allowing his mind to absorb the threshold he was about to cross. On one side of the glass was the safe, wealthy, boring existence of a retired Hollywood novelty. On the other side was the chaotic, bloody, uncompromising reality of his true nature. Without a flicker of hesitation, Henry Starr pushed the heavy doors open and stepped into the grand marble-floored lobby of the First National Bank. The transformation of the room was instantaneous. Henry drew his revolver, leveling the heavy steel barrel directly at the ceiling, and barked a single deafening command: "Everybody hands up, this is a robbery." The reaction of the civilians inside the bank provided an immediate, intoxicating rush of pure adrenaline that surged through Henry's veins like a potent narcotic. This was the exact sensation he had been starving for, the high that the motion picture industry had completely failed to replicate. On a film set, when he had shouted those words, the actors had obligingly raised their hands, their faces contorted into rehearsed, unconvincing masks of shock, waiting for the director's approval. But here, standing on the polished granite floor in Arkansas, the fear was breathtakingly authentic. He watched as the bank tellers froze, their faces draining of color, their eyes widening in genuine, unadulterated terror. He heard the sharp, involuntary gasps of the customers, the sudden clatter of a dropped pen echoing loudly in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. He could practically smell the sharp, metallic tang of their panic mingling with the scent of paper money and ink. This was not a performance. There was no safety net, no script to follow, and no predetermined outcome. The absolute power of life and death had returned to his hands. For the first time since he had limped out of the Callister Penitentiary, Henry Starr felt completely, vibrantly alive. The stifling boredom of the previous years evaporated, entirely eclipsed by the raw, electric tension of the heist. Operating with the practiced, mechanical precision of a veteran commander, Henry directed his men to secure the perimeter and empty the cash drawers. He moved through the lobby, his eyes constantly scanning the room for concealed weapons, his revolver steady and authoritative. He was a maestro conducting a symphony of fear, and the music was flawless. The vault was open, the currency was being shoved into canvas bags, and the operation was proceeding with the flawless, terrifying efficiency that had defined his legendary career. He had proven to himself that he was not a relic. He had proven that he could still bring the machinery of the modern capitalist system to a grinding, terrified halt. However, Henry Starr's brilliant, calculating mind had made one fatal, tragic miscalculation. He had accurately predicted the intoxicating thrill of the robbery, but he had severely underestimated how fundamentally the psychology of the American citizen had shifted. He was operating on the outdated assumption that unarmed civilians in a modern bank would simply cower and submit to the overwhelming threat of violence, just as they had in the 1890s. He failed to recognize that the First World War and the rapid industrialization of the country had hardened the populace. They were no longer willing victims. They were fiercely protective of their institutions and highly capable of lethal retaliation. Unbeknownst to Henry, the former president of the First National Bank, William J. Myers, was standing quietly in the rear of the building near the massive steel vault. Myers did not panic, nor did he freeze in terror. With a cool, terrifying composure that rivaled the outlaw's own, the former bank president stepped out of Henry's immediate line of sight and reached into a concealed corner. His hands closed around the cold, polished wood and heavy steel barrel of a Winchester repeating rifle, a weapon designed for hunting large game in the Ozark Mountains. Henry, his attention momentarily diverted by the loading of the cash bags, sensed a sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. The instincts that had kept him alive for 3 decades screamed an immediate warning. He began to pivot on his good leg, bringing his .38 caliber revolver around to acquire the new target. He was a fraction of a second too late. William J. Myers leveled the heavy hunting rifle, centered the iron sight squarely on the legendary outlaw's torso, and pulled the trigger. The silence of the bank lobby was violently, irrevocably shattered. But this was not the harmless popping sound of a theatrical blank cartridge, designed to produce a pleasing cloud of white smoke for the cameras. This was the deafening, concussive roar of a massive charge of gunpowder detonating in a confined space. The shock wave of the blast hit Henry's eardrums with disorienting force, rattling the glass windows of the bank. The heavy lead projectile, traveling at supersonic speed, struck Henry Starr precisely in the lower back. The kinetic transfer was absolutely devastating. It was not a cinematic wound that allowed for a dramatic, lingering monologue. The bullet tore through his heavy wool coat, ripped through his muscle tissue, and violently smashed into his spinal column, instantly and catastrophically severing his spinal cord. The sudden total loss of motor function in his lower extremities was terrifying. Henry's legs immediately collapsed beneath him like severed marionette strings. The heavy revolver slipped from his grasp, clattering uselessly away. He was thrown violently forward, his body crashing heavily onto the cold, unforgiving surface of the polished granite floor. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs in a sharp, agonizing gasp. As he lay paralyzed on the hard stone, a pool of dark, genuine crimson blood rapidly expanding across the pristine floor tiles, the absolute brutal reality of his situation crystallized in his fading mind. There was no comfortable mattress placed just out of frame to cushion his fall. There was no makeup artist rushing forward with a towel. The agonizing, burning pain radiating from his shattered spine was not a sensation he could simply turn off when the scene was finished. He stared up at the high, ornate ceiling of the bank, listening to the chaotic shouts of his fleeing accomplices and the heavy approaching footsteps of William J. Myers. The silence of the film set had been permanently replaced by the harsh, ringing aftermath of real gunfire. The grand Hollywood illusion had been entirely stripped away, leaving only the grim, undeniable mechanics of violent death. Henry Starr, the ultimate outlaw, had successfully cured his boredom. He had found his reality, and as the cold seared into his skin from the granite floor, he knew with absolute certainty that no director was going to step out from behind a camera to yell, "Cut." Henry did not die instantly. He lingered for 4 agonizing days in a local jail cell, his lower body completely paralyzed, a heavy fever cooking his brain as the infection spread from his shattered spine. Doctors offered him morphine to dull the excruciating pain, but true to his lifelong ascetic discipline, Starr refused the narcotics. He wanted to feel every ounce of his violent reality. When journalists and curious onlookers gathered around his iron cot, expecting a tearful Hollywood-style confession or a desperate plea for religious salvation, Starr violently rejected the script. He refused to give them the moralistic performance they craved. Staring up at his captors with fading yet fiercely unrepentant eyes, he proudly analyzed the tactical failure of his final heist, coldly blaming it on a slow accomplice rather than his own age. With his final breaths, he defiantly boasted, "I've robbed more banks than any man in America." He did not die in shame. He died in a state of euphoric relief, aggressively reclaiming his narrative. He had successfully cheated the boredom of Hollywood, demanding to be remembered as a genuine bleeding apex predator who died by the gun, rather than a domesticated celluloid novelty fading away in a California mansion. The true legacy of Henry Starr is a profound blood-soaked indictment of the entertainment industry. The corporate establishment believed they could purchase his obedience, sanitizing his violent life into a safe, consumable product. But for a man forged in the brutal fires of the frontier, the artificiality of the silver screen was a prison far more suffocating than any penitentiary. The daily humiliation of faking his own trauma to amuse the elite was a compromise his fierce pride simply could not endure. We console ourselves with the naive idea that such savage commodification belongs to a primitive era of early showbiz. Yet the underlying mechanics remain terrifyingly modern. Today, the digital attention economy relentlessly demands that we package our private lives and deepest flaws for public consumption. Henry Starr was merely the prototype of a culture perfectly willing to turn a human soul into a profitable spectacle. In the unforgiving machinery of the modern empire, there are no legendary heroes riding off into the sunset. There are only those who sell their stories and those who finally refuse to perform. The blood on the tiles of that Arkansas bank leaves behind a chilling echo. When the applause dies down and the stage lights go dark, would you rather live a safe, comfortable lie or die facing the brutal, undeniable truth?